Hey there, climate warriors. Welcome back to another episode of Are We Fucked? I'm your host, Lisa Camillo, anthropologist and filmmaker, here to navigate you through the chaos of our climate crisis with a side of sarcasm and a sparkle of irreverence. Today, we've got someone who's more than just planting seeds, he's planting revolutions. Meet Michael Hoag, the regenerative gardener and designer who's been knee-deep into the dirt for over 20 years. He's the author of Growing Free and Beauty in Abundance, and if you're on Instagram or TikTok, you might know him as the guy who makes permaculture look cool. Michael's the founder of the Transformative Adventures Cooperative and a full-time permaculture designer and consultant with over 300 projects under his belt. He's also spent 2 decades teaching people how to turn their backyards into eco-friendly Edens with minimal efforts. Yes, you heard right, game changer. In this episode, he's going to let us in on the secret of starting your very own permaculture veggie garden and give us tips that'll make you even the laziest gardener look like a green thumb guru, like myself. And not the guru part, but more the laziest gardener. So if you're tired of your garden looking like a sad patch of weeds, or if you just want to impress your friends with your new sustainable lifestyle, this is one episode you don't want to miss. Welcome to the show, Michael. I am so excited to be talking to you because in the past episodes, we spoke to a lot of experts from all over the world on climate change, on the state of the world, of the economy, of food supply, and basically they all say we're fucked and they were running out of food. That's why I'm very excited to be talking to you. What are your thoughts about that? Let's start with that.
Ciao, Lisa. I'm very happy to be talking to you too. So it's a very important topic. You know, as someone who grew up farming, I worked on farms of all different scales. I've also worked as an environmentalist. I traded commodities, sold crop insurance.
Wow.
I've studied the food system in depth, and I agree. I talk to a lot of people who are leading experts on our food system, and nobody quite knows, even the techno-optimists who think that technology is going to save us, they don't know how we're going to continue our current food production to 2050, the latest, and that's assuming that climate change doesn't start messing things up. So the people who are optimistic about it just say, well, there's probably some dude out there in his basement working on a thing. We don't know what that thing is, but I'm sure he'll figure it out.
There's nobody actually steering this ship. We are just drifting away, and it's very scary.
Yeah, there's a big belief in that kind of circles that technology is kind of its own thing. Technology is driving the ship, and it's somehow going to save it. They draw a graph and show a record of upward technological progress and yields and things, and it's been faltering the last decade or two, but they're saying, well, it's only time before it goes back up. Look at all this big line of progress. Progress is just an inevitable conclusion of this universe, I guess, and somebody's going to figure it out. We don't know what it is, have no idea, but somebody's going to figure it out. Everything's going to be fine. No worries, everything's going to be fine.
Let's just sweep everything under the carpet. Nobody's watching. Okay, so we moved from the city to the country and we bought a property with some land because what we think might be happening. So we want to start to grow stuff because everybody's saying grow your own thing, because the food chain supply is going to break down and everything is unpredictable. That's what we did. And I'm sure a lot of other people out there, the younger generation, are stuck in the city. But as we talked to David Holmgreen, one of the co-founders of Permaculture, he said, oh, it's possible in the city with the retro suburbia philosophy. How can we start growing our own food? Because I picture myself with a farmer's hat, like the emoji with a carrot in my hand, and not knowing where to start.
Yeah, that can be real problem for people. And with my background, doing a lot of farming and studying it a lot, and seeing that the standard ways that people were talking about it and teaching it just didn't seem to really be working for farmers. And it was really based on chemicals and pesticides and an industrial sort of food system.
The old school.
Yeah. And what we know is that leading researchers are calling us that system is the number one cause of climate change, of deforestation, mass extinction, ocean dead zones, soil depletion, and we know it's not sustainable. In addition to it just being a lot of work and not being great for the farmers, it's also causing a lot of environmental destruction. So I want to do something very different. And you mentioned David Holmgren and permaculture, and it was when I discovered permaculture. It was the first thing that I had found and heard of that really made sense to solve these problems that I experienced with my family farming and solve these environmental things. So I'll be talking a lot about that. And if you're out there and you're listening to this and you want to know where to get started, starting to look at permaculture as an alternative is a really great way to do it. And then on top of that, I would say within the permaculture community, the last few years, there's been this increase in focusing on what we're calling transformative process. Sounds kind of fancy.
Very.
Yeah. And this is how you really start to grow food in a way that's going to make sense for you. You do a standard conventional garden. The idea is you make a garden, you dig it, and then you plant your crops, and they're usually annual crops, annual vegetables. You got to raise them when they're seedling, and then they get bigger, and their crops are most vulnerable when they're seedling, And then if something happens to them or you leave for a month for your sister's wedding, the garden gets overrun with weeds and pests and everything dies. And then next year, you have to start all over again. You have to fill that again. And you can never get any further than that. Like if this year, your garden is big enough that it's not doing great, you're never going to have a garden that's any bigger than it, right? And every year you're going to have to redo the same thing. What a transformative process is, means we're trying to transform the landscape to a new state where it produces food and maintains itself so that we don't have to do work.
Amazing. Wow.
So ideally, when we make an installation, what I recommend is you make one garden, you get it really, really right so that in a year or two, it establishes itself like a little self-maintaining ecosystem.
Wow.
And then it'll keep kicking out food for years and years to come. And also it's going to be a lot more resilient to climate change and to weather weirding and all that stuff going on. Then you can move on to the next area, transform that, and the next area, and transform that. And in this way, we can take over the world.
This is a dream come true. So basically, how do we do it though? So we clean the garden. Do we have to clean the garden or plant around what's there?
Yeah, a great question. Do we just strip the ecosystem and start over with a clean slate of bare field? Or can we take the ecosystem that's there and work with it, collaborate with it? Is that they do both. In permaculture, we call this permaculture zone. To make this really, really super simple, what we're trying to do is have small, intensively managed gardens, like for vegetables, things like that we manage really carefully and get a ton of produce out of it, get a ton of yields out of it. But we keep that small and managed so that we can do it easy, And then the rest of the landscape becomes a collaboration with nature. And so I often say it's great to start with a little bit of both. So for someone who's starting out, and by the way, I have this thing that I call a landscape transformation program that I've been doing for about 15 years now. And so the whole idea was, how do we get people who've never done this before to do this and be successful on it? And over time, I start with one small, intensive garden for greens, for vegetables, a couple of beds, something like that. I have some ideas about how to do that. And then look at the rest of the landscape and figure out, can we make this edible meadow gill? Can we make this food forest?
Ooh.
And just start planting into it and tweaking it, letting it turn itself into productivity while we just focus on a small area.
Okay, so the next question is, what is food foraging? It sounds very magical, fairy-like, just eating from trees, just like being a princess with all the birds landing on you or something.
Yeah, the guy who coined the word permaculture, or the two guys, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison. And Bill Mollison had one of his first little movies was called In Danger of Falling Fruit. And that's the idea there. You create this landscape where you got to be careful because there's so much food just raining down all the time.
Oh, that'd be great.
It's a really interesting concept, and a lot of people are very skeptical of it. And so that's one of the kind of definitions of permaculture. You have these small intensive gardens, and then the rest of it we could say are forage farming. We create ecosystems with a lot of things to forage, and rather than intensively manage it, we just let the food grow with things like edible meadows and food forests. We could also call those edible forest gardens. And it's not exactly growing food in a forest. It's growing food like a forest. It's trying to imitate the things that make an ecosystem sustainable and stable over time. So that if it's taking care of itself, we don't got to do as much work.
Oh, I love that.
I was kind of skeptical of it at first, but actually I was working on a farm one day. And I remember that day we were cleaning up like the berry patch, the raspberry patch. And it can be a lot of hard work, doing that pruning, getting your hand all full of pickers, and you got to fertilize it. It was a lot of work. And afterwards, it was a beautiful day. So I got on my bike and I went to one of my favorite bike trails. And when I showed up there were like a few groups of people who were filling up buckets with black raspberries growing wild. Well, I went home and I got like 3-gallon buckets. I came back in my car and I filled up these 3-gallon buckets with black raspberries. And I wasn't the only person doing it there on this bike trail. That was the moment that it occurred to me. Here, I was spending all this time on the farm, weeding, watering, and fertilizing, and pruning, and plucking, and swishing bugs. And then I went to this bike trail, and those blackberries and black raspberries were just there, and nobody was watering them. Nobody was weeding. Nobody was pruning them, except maybe the deer coming by a little once in a while, and they do a little bit of fertilizing too. And yet that system was producing all of that food. And I was like, we're doing this wrong at the park. We're doing it wrong. And I could go back to that same little wild bike trail. And this place just really had been planted by birds because it was underneath power lines. And the birds would sit up there and they would drop seeds from the favorite plants that they ate.
Very cool.
So this whole hedgerow along this bike trail, I would go back there all season long. And it used to be next to an asparagus farm. So there was asparagus there, just growing wild still. There were different kinds of wild alliums there that I could harvest, onions and garlic there. There were tons of different berries, blackberries, black raspberries, mulberries, elderberries. There were some cherries there that were really good. Somebody had thrown out a wild pear at some point. There was a good pear there. There were some crab apples, grapes. I could go there and harvest all season long, and nobody was doing any work. And I went back there for 10 years while I lived in Illinois. It was my favorite foraging spot. And it was consistently like that year after year after year with no work.
Amazing. Nature is amazing. Seriously, nature, it's a miracle and we are fucking it. So I'm so upset about that. It's so uncool what we're doing. So, okay, can you make a food forest in your own backyard or in your own lands? Do you just eat stuff and shit around? It would be weird or you get arrested.
Yeah. You'd get arrested if you did that. So we have to be a little more sophisticated than the bird. But there actually was this tradition, like if you go to the British Isles, there are these hedgerows all the time. Actually, they're all over Europe. If you're a total agriculture nerd, there's this great book called European Field Boundary, documented the different kinds of hedgerow systems all over Europe. So you can read about them, what species are in them. But there was this old tradition where they would do what's called dead hedging. They would basically, they didn't have power lines, so they would put up, use fallen wood and make a fence basically out of it, a dead hedge. And the idea of it wasn't necessarily that that hedge would be a barrier. The idea was that the birds and things would hide under there, and birds would perch on it, and the birds and the wildlife would plant your linear food forest for you. So if we're talking about a huge landscape and you want to be super cheap and you want to plant a food forest, but you don't got any money, then you could just put up some kind of a wire or something that birds want to perch on, and you will get a food forest under that.
That's amazing.
And then you just select which plants you want. You can cooperate with the birds. If the birds want this, but you don't, you can pull that one out and leave this thing. And
Wow.
so that's one kind of strategy. We see what's there, we see what's coming in with nature, and we cooperate with it. Maybe we plant in some of the other things that we want. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of a fun thing. People for thousands of years have used nature and wildlife to create human food systems.
Wow, absolutely. It's very cool, this. I really love it. Is there another way, a little bit less cheap? How can we upgrade and to maybe speed things up?
Well, that's exactly the point. But if we want to have more of an idea of what is in our food forest and what the birds of this want to plant, then yeah, we can plant it, we can plant it out, we can look into what our favorite plants are, we can look into what grows really easily and pest-free in your area. Talk to farmers, talk to old-timers if you want to be real careful about it. And you can design out your food forest. And then we've got a really great tool in permaculture, which we call guild theory. And we'll get to that in a second. There is another way too, which is I was just talking about that bike trail that I used to go and forage at. When I got my first larger piece of property, which was just about an acre in a small college town, so that there was access to cultural resources, but there wasn't too many people running around crazy if it hits the fan. And so I got about an acre in an urban core, and that bike trail hedgerow I was talking about, I brought it home with me. I looked at it, I analyzed about what the species were in it, but then I upgraded something. Instead of just like the wild pears, I chose Asian pears that would be good in there. Instead of just having wild elderberries, I chose some of the named varieties of elderberries that have been cultivated or selected for better fruit quality. So I basically tried to imitate what's in nature. Well, that's one way you can do it. If you're out and about and you find a wild ecosystem like that, they're out there. And it's in your area on similar kind of soils and similar climate, and it's kicking out lots of food like that. You can imitate it and then tweak it a little bit to be more of the things that you want at a higher value. So that's one strategy, just straight up imitating nature, just straight up copying nature. And the other strategy is, as we were saying, you can actually just design it out. And then we can talk about what's called guild theory for how to do that. So, we have different ways of going about it, depending on what your budget is, how much of a nerd you are.
Okay, very cool. So if you would design your own, how would you place within this land you have, this little garden you have? Would you have things that protect your garden around, like little taller trees? Because I am a big fan of yours. I follow you on Instagram and TikTok. You have 200,000 followers. It's amazing and very inspiring, and also hopeful that young generations are interested in this. It's very cool to involve young people into the permaculture movement. So I've seen a few things, but I would love little tips here and there. And then I'm sure our listeners are going to follow you as well. How would you do it? Give us some gold.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an opinion about this. As I was saying before, a food forest, the best food forests, are not growing food in a forest. It's growing food like a forest and imitating that process. And it turns out in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot more academic research looking at traditional societies and how they do things. There are societies that essentially subsisted as food forest societies. This was a major part of how they met their needs. And one pattern that we see over and over and over again, especially in temperate climates, is what we could call a sun trap design. Some people are calling it the home garden pattern of humanity. This is found everywhere. If you want to just look, if you're out there and you're again a nerd, you will look at one thing. There's a great study called Home Gardens in Nepal, and it documents this particular pattern in Nepal. And so what we're looking for is kind of like a garden that's like a cell with a cell membrane, like you were saying, something to protect the outside. And so very often we'll have these linear food forest pipe systems around the edges that are like these hedgerows. These can be used to keep deer and even rabbits out and help prevent and help create a layer to protect the garden from pests. And it also produces a lot of food. We can create this cell membrane using these linear hedgerows. And then inside that, we can have some areas usually to the north in the northern hemisphere and to the south in the southern hemisphere. So with this open center, lots of sun gets into the middle. So we can grow vegetables, we can grow our tomatoes or peppers, all of this. And we have all these fruit trees as well around the edges. So that's a really great system for a food forest. We can have these hedges around the outside, have some small areas to the north with our favorite fruit and nut trees, and then have an area for more of our perennial vegetables, edible meadows, pensive gardens that get lots of sun. And that's the classic, in my opinion, best layout, and that's what I usually teach and what I go for. Sun trap design, cell membrane, hedgerows around all the edges so you can control what's coming and going and who's eating your food.
Very cool. Okay, we're going to start that then. You mentioned animals. Animals in, animals out. Because, for example, here in Sardinia, we have lots of wild boars in France and all over Italy, all around the Mediterranean. And I'm sure in America you have other things like coyotes or foxes or something like that. Sorry, my ignorance, but I put it all together.
Yeah.
America is so huge, and I'm sure you have so many different animals that can ruin your garden. But at the same time, maybe help too, because I guess also wild boars, for example, they lift the dirt, but can be very destructive. So, what is your opinion on that?
What I think is the most important and defining characteristic of permaculture is that spectrum of intensivity, cooperation with nature, and having a balance with nature. Having some areas in the landscape that are very controlled by humans. The point of them is to meet human needs. They're managed by us, intensive garden, and we want to keep wildlife out of those parts of the garden. And then there are other parts of the landscape where wildlife can be really helpful. Same thing with deer and rabbits and all that. So it's just a matter of collaboration. And that thing I was just talking about, surrounding a part of the property, it doesn't have to be the whole property. If you've got 20, 30, 40 acres, you might just want 1 acre of it, or even a half an acre, to be enclosed by that kind of hedgerow food forest system. And then we can do what's called cutting and laying, where you take that hedgerow and you cut it to the ground at some point, or mostly you leave some of it. And then you bend the branches and you weave them together to create a fence. It's called a cut and lay hedge. So you're actually making a really tight dense fence out of living trees. And that's really going to be really successful at keeping deer, wild boar, and things like that out of your main garden. And then it's pretty easy to just put up a very small piece of fence along the bottom of it to keep the rabbits out. And it's a great system for keeping most wildlife that could be damaging out of your intensive garden area. In permaculture, we're not trying to dominate the whole landscape. We're trying to make sure that there's space for nature in it as well. And we can grow a lot more food than you'd think on a smaller area and then have this wild foraging farm system for the rest of it.
Wow, super cool.
It's good for nature, it's good for soil, it's good for climate change, it sequesters carbon, it provides for biodiversity. It's a win for everybody.
Agreed. Wow. Another question is, what about insects? If you don't want to use pesticides, because come on, we have forever chemicals already in our bodies giving us all sorts of weird things. So how can we fight that? Do we fight it or do we embrace it?
Yeah. I actually just posted on Instagram and on TikTok and on Facebook. I have a part of my garden that's designed to just produce daily salad. So I'm going to be posting the pictures of it so you can see what my produce looks like. I do no spraying at all. I do no squishing of bugs. I don't even use organic sprays. I spend no time picking bugs or doing any kind of active pest control. So I use a few really hippie permaculture strategies instead. And if you want to see what the results look like, I'm not saying that my produce is 100% perfect, but it's pretty darn good. You go check it out. It's pretty darn good. And so there are 3 main strategies that I use for that. And the first, ecologists call this the resiliency or the diversity resiliency principle. has been well tested in the scientific literature. And that's basically states the greater number of species that there are in an ecosystem, the more resilience to pest and disease that will give the individuals in the system. So if you load up the garden with a lot of different diversity, and then there are specific kinds of diversity we want too. But if you load up the garden with lots of diversity, you interplant things a lot so that there's a big mix of different kinds of plants, you can end up with a garden where you're doing very little spraying and it'll look pretty good.
Fantastic. Wow.
In my opinion, if there's just one thing to do that I think is really good scientific research to back that will really dramatically reduce the amount of pest and insect pests in your garden would be recruit an army of beneficial insects for your garden.
What?
Yeah, because there are all sorts of insects that eat our plants. They're good guys. They're in the insect world, they're good guys and bad guys. We want more of the good guys, and we can summon them. We cast a spell on some of the good guys.
What's a spell?
It's not too difficult. When I want my friends to come over to my house, you know what I do? I tell them there's going to be food.
Nice.
I tell them I'm cooking, and they just magically appear. It's the same thing if you want the beneficial insect. In the scientific research, probably the single most important thing for this is a full season of blooms. You want from the earliest time possible, and in your climate, that probably means all through the winter. But you basically want to have high quality, beneficial insect attractor plants, and you want an abundance of those flowers intermixed with your vegetables every single day of the year. In temperate climates where there's a winter, we're still trying to go for the longest season possible. The more food we can provide every single day of the year for those pollinators and beneficial insects, predatory insects, the better pest control we're going to have. And then, if we want to add to that a second step, having a diversity of flower colors and flower shapes of really good pollinator plants that you can see a lot of different varieties and species of pollinators on, including not just bees, but also vested wasps, the little tiny wasps, all those good guys on those plants. And you have that all season long. Also, what makes your garden beautiful? If you follow this rule, your garden is going to be really beautiful. You're going to love that. It's going to be filled with a lot of cool flowers. A lot of those we can eat too. And you're going to have this army of beneficial insects that are to help patrol your garden and eat all of your aphids and eat all of your bugs and eat all the bad guys.
Wow, that sounds like heaven. So I'm going to do the devil's advocate because that's what we're going towards. No much water. So how do you solve that problem? Because I'd love to have flowers. Who doesn't? Seriously. This area, Italy, Europe, Portugal, Spain, we have listeners from all over the world. So how can we do it? Because we have big droughts. So how can we solve that?
Yeah, there are a few really great tools we can use for that. I'm going to start with the one that I think is going to be the most important in a climate change world. Most of us these days have kitchen sinks, and we have showers, and we take showers, and we wash our clothes, and we use the toilet. Well, let's stay away from the toilet for now, but we wash our clothes, we take showers, we wash our hands in the sink, we have water in the sink. And most of that water, we say bye-bye to, and it's gone.
True.
In permaculture, one of my favorite patterns is called a gray water wetland. So you go down into your basement, you find where your water lines are, and wherever your water is going, if it's going to like a septic system or going to a sewer system, we can divert the parts that are not black water that we've done our business in. It's the other water is called gray water. Water you wash your hands, wash your dishes in, wash your clothes in. And we can divert that into a little wetland system that we create in our garden. What we do is we create a couple of different small ponds or wetlands. And each wetland helps filter and clean that water so that by the time it gets to our garden and our garden areas, it's good and it's clean. And then we route the water, when it's done being cleaned, through the intensive garden area. So what I was talking about before, where we have these some areas of the garden are super intensive. So this is one really great way. We can create this ecosystem, even in fairly dry climates. Here in the United States, we have Mediterranean climate too. And these kinds of systems can create a little micro system that's almost like it's not temperate or almost like it's not a Mediterranean climate, because it's getting this influx of water all the time, every day of the year, that would otherwise just be wasted water. And so those are the areas I really like to integrate in all of my intensive gardening. This is what we call guild theory. I have those different kinds of plants to take care of the garden. I have mulch maker plants I can chop and drop to mulch that garden. And I have these beneficial insect attractor plants. And I try to make sure that in my intensive garden area, I have plants that are flowering for almost every day of the season. So that kind of strategy gives us at least one way where it really minimizes the amount of active irrigation we're doing by recycling water that would otherwise just be wasted into the garden.
Wow.
And it also provides fertility, because wetlands generate fertility and create soil. This is kind of a big secret too. So that gray water wetland doesn't just irrigate your garden, it makes it super fertile and super productive, because wetlands create fertility and healthy soil faster than any other kind of ecosystem. So we're creating a superpower productivity battery right in the middle of our garden when we use the strategy.
When you talk about wetlands, like kind of a ponds-like sort of thing, an area that has a bit of a dense and you can get the water there and it sort of becomes a little bit murky and something like that. I'm so ignorant about this stuff, but I love to learn.
Yeah, that's such a great question. It depends on how creative you are. There could be a lot of different ways you could set this up. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're already getting ideas about how to do this, great. Maybe your ideas are better than mine. But here's a classic approach on what I usually set up. We have our gray water from our house, and we route that. And first we have a small little pond area. And so I might dig this out. I try to stay away from plastic, so I would use a clay, sodium bentonite clay pond liner for this. A lot of times I've seen people use old bathtub, old ceramic caniform bathtub. They put a little wetland. And that's how big it is.
Oh, wow.
That's how big the first one is, about the size of a bathtub. And then it needs reeds in it. So things like cattails, things like phragmites, these are basically wetland grasses, because wetland grasses have a symbiotic relationship with microbes. This is just like with the pests. We have good insects and bad insects, and the same thing with pathogens and microbes. They're good ones and they're the bad ones. Now, the good ones often eat the bad ones, and grasses usually have a relationship with good ones that eat and store excess nitrogen and kill pathogenic bacteria. So the first one could be just basically a little mini pond. I would often fill this with rocks to give you a place to plant your reeds into. So you fill it with little rocks and pebbles, you plant your reeds into there, and then, as the water overflows from that, it can go into a second pond.
Wow.
And a lot of times people will use 2 or 3 of these. Just to be super safe, because gray water kind of takes people out.
Yeah.
And so you might do a couple of those where it goes through and gets cleaned and filtered. Some people who are really concerned about pollution and climate change might use one like bathtub or one pond that's filled with activated charcoal, just to really make sure they're cleaning out any kind of viruses, potential pathogens. I don't personally think that's necessary, but hey, if you want to do it, you can. And then afterwards, this flows to a pond system. You can also route all of the water that falls on your house in the wet season to help, or in any kind of rains, to also go into this much larger pond system. And then we can plant edible plants into that pond. The water's been cleaned. And then the overflow from that pond can be routed into your vegetable garden bed. That's a classic permaculture system for this wetland, little mini wetland that's fed by your runoff from your house. And it can be designed so that in the summer or the dry season, there's not a whole lot in it. And then maybe you can just route the water directly so the pond can be dry. You just route the water directly from your gray water stuff directly into your garden.
Super cool. I'm going to become such a nerd with this. I'm obsessed. It's really, really cool. Okay, but stagnant water just reminds me of mosquitoes. Could that be a problem?
Again, this really comes back to that balance and that trade-off between good organisms and bad organisms. Pretty much every place in the world, mosquitoes are a big problem. There's been research that shows that if you have a healthy wetland ecosystem with, again, some diverse plants and things like that, around about 30% of the coverage of the water, you'll have lots of beneficial organisms that keep pathogens and keep things like mosquitoes in balance. You'll probably see some mosquitoes, but there's actually been research in the United States and places like Florida where we have like mosquito apocalypse. These places that are wet all year round and just are filled with mosquitoes, that creating a healthy wetland is a proven way to reduce the total number of mosquitoes in the area. So it's really counterintuitive. You could think, if I create a wetland, I'll have more mosquitoes. But in reality, if we create a healthy wetland, because that biodiversity resiliency principle, we get a total reduction of the mosquitoes in the area. But I also have another thing to it, which is there are such things like organic mosquito dumps. And if you really don't want mosquitoes, and you just have a small area of wetland, you can just throw an organic mosquito dunk.
Is this in your book? How to make a mosquito dunk? What is it? I don't even know what a mosquito dunk is. Sounds disgusting.
Yeah, it's not made of mosquitoes. Don't worry. It's usually made of plants that have oils in them that kill the larval form of the mosquitoes in the water. And usually you buy them in a solid form. It just kind of floats on the top of the pond and slowly breaks down. And a lot of them, you can just throw it in there about once a season. You need about one per season. These days, so long as there are like stores and things, you can buy them. They're pretty readily available, and they are organic, and they only affect mosquitoes. So they don't reduce any beneficial insects and microbes in the garden. They just kill the mosquito to make sure there's no mosquitoes. But yeah, you can actually make these by figuring out, you'd have to research, I don't know the flora there in Sardinia, but you can research it and find what plants in your area, because there are probably plants that can include the kinds of phytochemicals.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been illuminating. And now I can't wait to get my hands dirty, literally. And we're going to keep following you on Instagram, on TikTok, and get your book as well. I'm very excited about that, actually. My husband is going to love it. So thank you very much, Michael. Really loved it.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
And that's a wrap, everyone. Big thanks to Michael Hoag for teaching us how to turn our backyards into paradise with minimal efforts. Remember, if you can transform a garden, you can at least try to keep a houseplant alive. Don't forget to follow Michael on Instagram and TikTok to keep up with his latest permaculture adventures. You'll find him spreading the dirt literally and figuratively everywhere. Check out his website, transformativeadventures.org, for lots of resources, his books, online classes, and much more. By the way, if you miss our previous episode, it's a guided meditation. Not your usual one. It's funny and sure to help you relax, de-stress, and snooze faster than a sloth on ketamine. Picture a world without pollution, where humans live in harmony with nature. Yes, kind of like a Disney movie, but without the catchy songs. If you're feeling overwhelmed about the state of the world, join us on this peaceful journey and find your inner zen amidst the chaos. This podcast series is produced by Against the Tide Films. For more info, check out our website at againstthetidelefilms.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate, and set a reminder to tune in every Wednesday for a new episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and now also on YouTube. Also, follow us on Instagram at @wefact_the podcast to stay updated on all things Are We Fact. And while you're out there digging the dirt, don't forget to take care of your mental health. If the state of the world is making you freak out, remember you're not alone. Seek help if you need it. There is no shame in getting a little TLC for your brain. This is Lisa Camillo signing off. Stay sarcastic, stay green, and as always, keep fighting the good fight. Until next time, climate warriors.